Today, let's do a thrift flip where we change a jacket into this cute purse. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we have another Stitchmas video. Today's is a thrift flip. So this is actually a little vest that I had when I was younger. I absolutely love it. It does not fit anymore, and I wanted to figure out a way to reuse it so that I could keep it around. I just wasn't ready to actually donate and get rid of it. So what I'm going to be doing is I am going to be removing the lining from the outside portion of the jacket so that I can have the two different kinds of fabrics. I could see how much I had to work with, and then I decided that I wanted to turn it into a bag. So I drew out two different options, and I did put this on Instagram to ask which one did people like better, as well as a YouTube short. And most people liked the square shaped bag. So I was thinking of doing a magnetic closure at the time and then having it be these different square shaped panels. The magnetic closure did not happen. I ended up using a button, as I'll show later. But once I decided on the square shaped bag, I then drew out all of the different panels that I would need for both the outside and the inside and figured out how much fabric I actually had on hand. I noticed that I was going to need to use rectangular shapes, and I also wanted to be sure that I kept some of the details from the vest. So specifically, it has these little like faux pockets on the sides. I wanted to use that for like the flap of the bag so that it would be folding down and have that little pocket. So the first step was to cut out that piece so that I could see how big it would end up being. So for mine, I ended up doing this around like 6.5 inches by 8 inches just for that main front panel, and this was going to be the flap that allowed me to keep that little faux pocket, and then I built the bag around that. So then I knew that I just needed to cut out a bunch of different rectangular shapes, so specifically 3 long rectangles, then 2 squares, and then I have my flap, and then I also have a rectangle on the top as well. And then I really want to keep this button as that was a main part of the vest that I loved. And then I just basically need to cut out a piece of each of these that I did for the outside of the bag with the lining as well. So thankfully I did have enough material for the lining to be able to have enough that'll be on the inside of the bag. I did have to piece together one more for the exterior portion with the outside fabrics. As you can see here, some of these are pieced a little bit differently just so I could make sure that I had enough fabric overall, but you're not actually going to be able to see that piece. So now what it was time to do was actually build the bag. So I started to sort out the pieces to make sure that I knew the lining versus the outside of the fabric, and then I wanted to be sure that I was doing the right sides together. So I started to build this out. I first did the lining, so I'm going to be pinning up the long edges. So this would be like the back and then the 2 sides, and then I did that also for the outside of the fabric. So pinning up with right sides together, the back and then those 2 sides, and then I just started to take seams. So the lining material was a little slippery to the idea that I did need to take my time when sewing it. The velvet luckily is not a stretch material, so I was able to just use a straight seam the entire time and didn't need to worry about that. Once I had that done, I then continued on sewing the bag up. So I sewed that other front panel onto the main portion of the bag, so attaching it to both the sides and then repeating this for the lining, sewing all that up so that I essentially had this cube shape. Then it was just time to sew the bottom onto each of the bag as well as the lining itself so that I would get the square shape that I was looking for. So a lot of this was just going back and forth between adding the pieces of fabric together as well as sewing the exact same idea for the lining, and then I'll be inserting those into each other so that there's no raw edges. Now, because of how I set this up, and especially with that flap on the top, I was needing to consider that I needed a kind of a rectangular portion at the top so that it would be this full overall flap. So I attached that on. I also made sure that I added a lining portion for that, just so that again there was no raw edges, everything would look nice and neat and ready to go. So this is currently what my bag looks like. You can see on the inside it looks really nice. This is going to be the outside portion of the bag. And so now it was just time to turn this right side out so I could see what the bag looked like, and I think it was looking really good. So now I just repeated all of these steps for the lining, so making sure I was sewing that lining flap onto the other flap portion, and then at one point I did add this like little rubberized elastic so that it would be able to hook onto the button piece, and this is going to be at the point of that flap. So when we show the bag at the very end, you'll see like how all this came to be. But here's my flap. You see that little elastic piece at the bottom, and then I do have my bag overall. So now what it's time to do is I got a piece of cardboard just to stick into the bottom, and I'm going to be sewing 3 of these edges up, and I'm basically making little pockets for the cardboard to go in. So I wanted this bag to have shape, and I ended up using cardboard for this. I will say that I don't think this was the way to go. Like, looking at this bag now, and especially once it's finished, It's more of a decorative piece for me, and I had asked people, how did you think I should make this have more of a structure? Someone had said to use maybe like really cheap plastic cutting boards. Someone else had said cardboard. There was a lot of different ideas. I think that what I should have gone with though was using like a really stiff interfacing, and I just wasn't quite sure how to do that. So I basically just sewed up all these little pockets, making sure that I would have places for my cardboard to go. So it would be going on the outside of the bag, it would be going for all the sides, and then I am going to be adding a piece onto that flap. So it was just a lot of cutting, making sure that everything was fitting correctly, and then just this continued process so that I could see how it would stand. Once I did this, I saw that, like it was working, it was standing. It was just slightly more delicate than what I was expecting it to be, especially if this was a bag that I wanted to continue to use. So once I gotten all that cardboard in, it was all on the sides, I then did all these steps for the flap as well. Once everything was sewn up and it was all ready to go, the flaps were created for the cardboard, I did start to think about how I was going to be adding straps. So I had these really pretty little gold hooks, and I thought that they would be a great way to add straps onto the bag, or at least that one handle. So I had a little bit of my fabric left over. I had kept all the scraps in case I needed to use it again. So I just cut out a little strip that was about, I think, like 8 inches by 2 inches, and wrapped it around that little hook so I could see what it would look like. Then I just folded this over to create one long strap. Then I cut the strap in half after I turned it right side out. And then this was going to be what I would be using for those hooks. So now all I had to do was cut this in half, and that it gave me those 2 pieces that I would need. And this was a great way for me to be able to add some hardware onto my bag and also give it this really nice gold touch, as I think the gold and the burgundy looked really good together. Now it was really just time to start bringing all of these different pieces that I had. So I had this lower portion of the bag, I have the top little flap part, and then I have that hardware. So what I did was I went through and pinned up all of the edges at the top portion for those 3 edges and pin them. So I'm just going to be taking a seam all the way around. So I'm not sewing into the cardboard at this point, I'm just making it so those raw edges go away. Now for the flap, where you can see that one raw edge, that's where we're going to be connecting the flap to it, that way it folds over. And then what I've done on either side for those short edges, I've added that little piece of hardware. I just insert that down so that when I'm taking the seam, so as you can see I'm doing this a hand seam, I'm sewing all of these different individual pieces together so that the bag is really becoming one. So you're going to have that lower portion of the bag as well as these little pieces of hardware that I've done. And I think overall it looked really good. Like you could see that there weren't really any more raw edges for the main portion. We have that one where we're going to be adding the flap. For the flap, what I did was I just basted this so that the lining and the outside of the fabric were together. And then I just inserted that into where that opening was. And then again, just hand stitched all of this closed so that the flap was now attached to the bag. And then I have this little button still from earlier that I saved, and I'm going to be sewing that onto the bottom of the bag so that we are able to fully close this. So as you can see, this is currently what my bag looks like. I think it turned out really well. But I did want to do kind of one other little thing. So on this pocket part, I found that I had some beads, and I decided to just do a little beading effect with different burgundies and clear and crystal, just to give it a little extra sparkle and touch, since this vest did mean a lot to me and it was one of my favorite pieces, and as I could tell, this was starting to become more of a decorative item, so I wanted to have just something a little extra special with it. The last step was to just sew up a strap that I could use for the bag. This was really easy. I just took a long piece of that fabric scrap that I had left over, sewed it up, and then just hand sewed it onto that hardware so that the entire bag could now be complete. I actually really like how it turned out. I'm really excited that I have a way to keep this piece of clothing that meant a lot to me, and I can now have it on display in my sewing room and I can see it. Remember, this is what the vest originally looked like, and now I have a whole bag from it, so I'm super excited with how this turned out. If you like this video and you want to see more thrift flips, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.